the title there is not an empty vessel, but is an empty vessel. Is she an empty vessel? And I debated whether to include that question mark or not, because I didn't want anyone to think that I was denigrating Galadriel or calling her a vacuous character, because she's not. She's one of Tolkien's most engaging creations. She has been the subject of many, many, many different studies. And when I started looking at those studies, the question that I started to ask myself was, well, which Galadriel? We have so many different Galadriels. So this project actually kind of grew like a leaf on Niggle's tree. The tree is my dissertation, and as I started looking at the leaves around the dissertation, it kind of led off into this one. So you'll have to indulge me. This is not part of my full dissertation. It's one of the leaves that I found to be very interesting. It arose in the consideration of the Christian and non-Christian interpretations of Galadriel. And that consideration gave way to larger questions about Christopher Tolkien's role in shaping Galadriel, in presenting his father's unpublished material. Galadriel is sort of an example of the larger problem. So the difficulty, pinning down a single unified Galadriel, exemplifies that larger problem in critical interpretations. She has many different portrayals. There's not one single Galadriel. There's many different Galadriels. There's the canonical and the apocryphal Galadriels. How can and how should we reconcile all those different portrayals? I've broken it down into sort of four areas. There's what I call the canonical Galadriel. She's the Galadriel that we know from the Lord of the Rings and from the Silmarillion. And then there's the apocryphal Galadriel, those extra narrative characterizations that we see in Tolkien's posthumous writings and in his letters. Then there's the problem of critical interpretation. How do we interpret this character amid those multitude of Galadriels? And finally, we have derivative portrayals of Galadriel. As more and more audiences are coming to Tolkien, whatever Tolkien might be these days, they're coming to it from non-traditional routes. They're coming through derivative portrayals that are now becoming conflated with Tolkien's original. So to start with, I'd like to take a look at what I call the canonical Galadriel, the Galadriel that we know from the Lord of the Rings and from the Silmarillion. I started doing the research using History of Middle-earth, but I remembered, hey, I'm at Marquette University, and that building right behind me holds all the original manuscripts. That's why I came to Marquette. So I went into the archive, and I started looking at the emergence of Galadriel. I wanted to see how this character became the Galadriel that we all know and love. And I found some interesting things. She emerged slowly. She did not emerge fully formed. She grew in stature. At first, she and the character that we know as Celeborn had no names. They were simply the Lord and Lady. Character makes her first appearance as just the Lady in draft material as the blindfolded fellowship is making its way through Lorien. And as the narrative continues, it's interrupted by a note that's only partially legible. Christopher Tolkien records it as Lord of the Galadrim and, or maybe a lady, something illegible, went to the White Council. And this is recorded. I put my references to volume number for History of Middle-earth. And fortunately, I did find that the American Houghton Mifflin editions and the British Unwin Hyman editions, as the publisher was at that time, the pagination is the same. Very convenient. I thought that illegible part might be ROA, but it doesn't really matter what the illegible part is. What's important is that when the character makes her first appearance, she and the Lord are absent. And so Tolkien is considering, okay, well, what are these characters? Who are they? Why are they important? And she finally makes her appearance. Unfortunately, because of the way the PowerPoint has shifted from one to the other, it didn't quite go the way I wanted it to. But the next occurrence of the lady is when loosing a fellowship's blindfolds. This is what's in the manuscript. Also, said Hathildir, they bring me a message from the Lord and Lady of the Galadrim, and it's underlined in red pencil. Christopher records it as also, said Hathildir, they bring me a message from the Lord. He doesn't mention Lord and Lady, and he doesn't mention that underline. But he does mention this note, which is also in that same red pencil. And the note is, Lord, ? If Galadriel is alone and is wife of Elrond. So he's having doubts, Tolkien is having doubts about the presence of the Lord, either at this scene or in the narrative altogether. The next time we encounter them, they now have names, Celeborn and Galadriel, and not just Lord and Lady. It's when they reach Caras Galadon, and I really apologize the way that this is superimposed. But it says, here dwell Celeborn and Galadriel, the Lord and Lady of the Galadrim, said Haldir. It is their wish that you should go up and speak to her. Something that Christopher doesn't record in History of Middle-earth is these red brackets. And elsewhere he said that these brackets, whenever we see these brackets, they're indications for removal, that he intends to remove that in later drafting. He also doesn't record these notes that we see here, here, and here. Dwell is changed to dwells. It's got a little question mark. He's questioning, do I want to change this? And he's changed these pronouns, there and them, to her. So if he carried through on this intention, the sentence would read, here dwells Galadriel, the Lady of the Galadrim. It is her wish that you should go up and speak to her. So based on that note and the previous note, Tolkien seems to be having doubts about the Lord, as if he's going to remove the Lord. Ultimately, he decides not to. The queries, alterations, and proposals were all ultimately rejected, likely at the same time, because they're all written in the same red pencil, but then they're all struck through with the same blue pencil. So unfortunately, we have the superimposition again, but all those notes are struck through with that same blue pencil, including the brackets. They're struck through. They're marked for deletion as well. I apologize the way it's arranged. It just didn't quite. But the idea is that struck through that struck through that, so on and so forth. So what I think happens is that the character that would become Galadriel, she enters the narrative just as the consort of the Lord. The draft of the plot notes continue, very similar to the published version, but the Lord is the focus. There's still the episode with the mirror, but it's called the King's Mirror. The Lord, the King, Galdaran, as he's named at that time, is present at that episode, not Galadriel. But then Tolkien has doubts, he has hesitations, and he temporarily removes the Lord. But then when he changes his mind, and the Lord comes back in, during that time, the lady, Galadriel, has undergone this elevation in stature. And a lot of the wisdom, a lot of the things that characterize Celeborn in the original drafts are now given to Galadriel. The narrative continues on as before, with some slight changes here and there. But the Galadriel that we know and love emerges, I think, during that part where Tolkien is having doubts about the Lord. The lady's stature is elevated, and then when the Lord re-enters, the focus of this fellowship sojourn has now shifted to Galadriel. As Bill Fliss and I were discussing it, he said, yes, every now and then it seems to me that Galadriel kind of married down, because she's the focus of the fellowship sojourn in Lorien. And then we have Galadriel in the Silmarillion. Galadriel's history as it's presented in Lord of the Rings, the statements that she makes about herself, places her in the Silmarillion, but she did not exist in the Silmarillion as it existed at that time. So Tolkien began a revision of the Silmarillion in the early 1950s, and he inserted Galadriel back into the Silmarillion by making her the daughter of Finarfin. And interestingly, when I was looking through referencing this and referencing that and trying to figure out just how she came in and what were the circumstances, I found that there's actually no smoking gun that says that Galadriel is the youngest of all the Finarfin's children. There is evidence that says that she's younger than Finrod, but nothing that definitively states that she's the youngest of all of the Finarfin's children. So that might have been just an editorial decision that Christopher made. Seems to make sense, but I just found it interesting. So Galadriel's appearance in the revised Silmarillion. First off, we have the later Quintus Silmarillion, the revision that he began in the wake of the Lord of the Rings. That establishes her as the daughter of a princess of the Noldor. The Annals of Aman, 1958, details her role in the debate of the Noldor in the wake of the Darkening. And the Grey Annals, her sojourn in Doriath, her relationship with Melian, where she learned much of her wisdom. These are the primary sources that Christopher used to make the Silmarillion. Towards the end of the Silmarillion, when he had to use other sources, when we encounter Galadriel there, they're usually editorial insertions from another source text. This happened, this happened, this happened, and these took part, and Galadriel. He just sort of dropped her name in there just to sort of remind us that she's still there. But the main thing for her characterization comes from these sources. So here's the canonical Galadriel. We sum it all up. Here's the canonical Galadriel. She's born in the noontime of Valinor. She desires a realm of her own to rule. That motivates her to join in the rebellion. She did not take part of the kinslaying, but she refused Nondos's warning to return and went into exile. She dwelt in Doriath. She learned much wisdom from Melian. By the end of the Third Age, she's the Lady of Lorien. When the ring bearer comes to Lorien, she was tempted by his offer. She resisted the temptation, and after the destruction, she went back into the West. That's sort of her canonical story. The things that she did in between, that's stuff that's going to come in the apocryphal Galadriel. So the apocryphal Galadriel are those extra narrative statements, the further evolution. Tolkien didn't stop there. He continued to develop that character even after the publication of The Lord of the Rings. He developed her in comments to readers. He developed her in what I call extra narrative statements that sometimes conflict with the Galadriel that she's presented in The Lord of the Rings. I call that the apocryphal Galadriel. And I got to note that even the canonical Galadriel of the Silmarillion is semi-apocryphal because her canonicity was imposed upon her by Christopher Tolkien's editorial choices. He had all of that material to work with, and he said, these are the things I'm going to put into the Galadriel in the published Silmarillion, and not these. So if she is considered canonical in Silmarillion, it's because that was imposed upon her by Christopher's editorial choices. And I've seen some studies that say, well, Christopher went beyond his authority. She went beyond the bounds of what an editor should do. He went against his father's expressed wishes. Well, there's his father's expressed wishes right there from his will that grants Christopher full and unalienable right to do as he will. So even though she's semi-apocryphal, I think the claim to canonicity has primacy. So that's why I call that Galadriel the Silmarillion, the canonical Galadriel. The sources for the apocryphal Galadriel are primarily these sources right here. And those dates are important. There's an essay called Concerning Galadriel and Celeborn, which I dated to 1958, even though Christopher doesn't give a firm date for it based on the names that occur in there and the spellings of certain names. I date that to around 1958. Around 10 years later, he comes back and revises his character of Galadriel in the Shibboleth of Feanor. The full version is published in Volume 12 of the History of Middle-earth, but it's excerpted. The relevant portion is excerpted in Unfinished Tales. This doesn't have a title, Last Notes. It's just the title I gave it, but it's probably the last thing that he ever wrote on the Legendarium in the last month of his life. And then, of course, there's comments in his letters. But Christopher has said that he did not take these and integrate them into the Silmarillion because they were aspirational statements. The only things that had been said in the narrative were those things that I showed you from the canonical Galadriel. And so Christopher felt, this is what I have to use in order to complete the project that I want to complete. Yes, these are interesting, but since they're not part of the narrative tradition, he decided not to use those in the published Silmarillion. And if he'd have stopped with the published Silmarillion, that'd have been fine. This presentation would be over. But because he chose to go on and publish alternative conceptions, and he chose to publish it in an editorial mode and not a narrative mode, that's what gives rise to the multitude, the multiplicity of Galadriels. So in concerning Galadriel and Celeborn, the circumstances of her flight are not quite described, but they can be assumed to be in keeping with what's in the Silmarillion. Her exile is self-imposed, both for her love of Celeborn and a sense of duty to remain. Sometime between 1958 and the Shibboleth of Feanor, Tolkien conceives of a ban. In the Concerning Galadriel and Celeborn essay and in the Silmarillion material, there's no idea that Galadriel is specifically banned from returning, but the lament that she sings in The Lord of the Rings seems to indicate that she believes her exile is permanent, that she believes there's a ban. And Tolkien may have taken that idea and later extended to say, yes, there is in fact a ban on her specifically, and that's why she's there in Middle-earth. And that was the conception that remained until 1968 with the Shibboleth of Feanor. Her flight from the Blessed Realm is in the context of the Noldor's rebellion, but the circumstances have changed drastically. In the Silmarillion tradition, she's present at the flight of the Noldor. She's present at the kinslaying, but in this revised consideration, she's now fighting on behalf of the Teleri. So she's actually fighting against Feanor, and she goes into exile not because she wants a realm of her own, but because she wants to thwart Feanor and his designs out of revulsion from the kinslaying. And she refuses the pardon of the Valar at the end. So the ban has been, there's no longer a ban, but she remains because she has refused her pardon. But then the last thing he writes in his last notes, he revises this, the conception together, and it removes Galadriel from the rebellion of the Noldor altogether. She has nothing to do with the rebellion, for or against. She happens to just be there when Feanor comes and her kinslaying happens, and she despairs, and she goes into exile. So she has nothing to do with the rebellion whatsoever. And at the end of the age, she's summoned to return, but she decides not to. So there's no ban, there's no pardon, there's just her decision not to remain, or her decision to remain, not to return. And of course, there are comments in Tolkien's letters. But none of these comments add up to a single consistent Galadriel. They're in response to specific queries from specific readers on specific points. And what he has to say is in the context of however he's thinking about Galadriel at the time he's saying it. So if you took all of his letters about Galadriel and put them together, you wouldn't find a single Galadriel. You'd find lots of conflicting statements. However, his letters are still a good guide to what he's thinking and why he's thinking the way he is. So you put all that together, and that leads to what I call the problem of critical interpretation. They assume a stable and a consistent character. It's understood between the critic and the audience that the subject is the same between us. If I am saying this is how I am, this is this character, and these are her motivations, this is how she should be interpreted, then I am implicitly saying I'm using this model of the character, and I'm assuming that you, the audience, have that same model in mind. But we don't have a single model. We have so many different models. Tolkien's inability to settle on a particular Galadriel renders that single and consistent interpretation impossible. The critic and the audience can construct a Galadriel from any possible number of Galadriels. Almost like a cafeteria menu. You can pick and choose which Galadriel you want. I'll take a little bit from this one, a little bit from that one, and this supports my argument. Christopher Tolkien's presentation of the Silmarillion in a narrative mode fixed a certain conception, that canonical Galadriel. But then his presentation of alternative conceptions in an editorial mode poses further questions. Do we take those alternative conceptions and do we read them back into the Galadriel that we know from the Lord of the Rings? And if so, which one? Because however you do it, it's going to have consequences for her temptation by the ring, which is the sine qua non of her character. That's the central fact of Galadriel in the Lord of the Rings. Everything goes through that moment, her temptation by the ring. The things around it change. The nature of her fault, the nature of her sin, and her redemption changes. But they all pass through that moment. So depending on what this is, it changes the nature and the context of that moment. And that's the chart that shows this is how things are changing. The fault, the sin, we might call it, the consequence of that sin, the stakes of her temptation, and how she is ultimately redeemed. So you take any one of these, and you'll notice that as you go, the nature of the sin changes, and it gets less and less and less severe as you go. Almost as if Tolkien is absolving her as he goes, lessening her guilt. And thus, the stakes of her temptation change. None of those interpretations were published during the author's lifetime. Later conceptions never integrated into the main Silmarillion narrative, but they reflect Tolkien's own conception of the character and how her portrayal in The Lord of the Rings should be understood at that point in his thinking. So the authority of all of these different interpretations is reader dependent. Which of them has the ultimate authority? Well, all of them and none of them. The only thing that has authority is that moment right there. But because of all the changes to this and everything that happens downstream from that, these all seem to have an equal claim to authority. It depends on what you as the reader, what you as the critic, what you as the audience want to read into that moment. But there is one curious case, because as I said, none of these were published during Tolkien's lifetime, except for one. There is one curious case, and that is in The Road Goes Ever On. It's a special case. It's the only extra narrative statement that I know of that was published during Tolkien's lifetime. Road Goes Ever On was in 1968. The material that Tolkien wrote to accompany it was presumably written before that, 1967 or so. Tolkien began corresponding with Donald Swann in 1965. The ultimate project was published in 68. So during that time, there was the conception of a ban in place. And Tolkien specifically mentions the ban in the material that he prepared to accompany The Road Goes Ever On. However, he presented that in his capacity as author, not as capacity of in-universe lore master that characterizes so much of his extra narrative statements. So, yes, Tolkien did make a statement about Galadriel, a statement that he changed his mind about later, but yet that was the only extra narrative statement that was published during his lifetime. So that may have some special authority that other extra narrative statements might not have. Letter 297 was written about the same time, and it also specifically references a ban. So the question to ask is, can and should these different conceptions be reconciled to each other to produce a single Galadriel? And if so, what should that model be? Has anybody read To Kill a Mockingbird? Has anybody read Go Set a Watchman? So you've seen vastly different Atticuses or Attici. Attici.
Yeah.
That's the only situation I can kind of compare it to. Go Set a Watchman and To Kill a Mockingbird. Atticus Finch, as he's portrayed in To Kill a Mockingbird, has been the subject of innumerable studies and has enormous impact on both the literary community and the legal community. A lot of folks said they went into law because of Atticus Finch. And he's portrayed as being an upstanding, moral person standing against this corrupt racial caste system in the American South. Gregory Peck's portrayal of him has become iconic in the movie. And then shortly before Harper Lee died, Go Set a Watchman is published. Same character, Atticus Finch, but he's very, very differently portrayed. He's portrayed as a racist. He's portrayed as a bigot. He's portrayed as all the things that the Atticus Finch of To Kill a Mockingbird is not. Even though he does all of the things that happen in To Kill a Mockingbird, his motives are far different. So do we now revise the Atticus Finch of To Kill a Mockingbird, knowing what we know about Go Set a Watchman? It completely changes that character. Complicated by the fact that we later find out that Go Set a Watchman was actually a first draft of To Kill a Mockingbird. So do we treat these as two different characters? Or do we ignore one character altogether and just focus on the one because that's the one we want? Or do we try to reconcile them somehow? That's the question I ask about Galadriel now. Whenever we talk about Galadriel, which Galadriel are we talking about? And should they be reconciled to each other? To illustrate the problem of critical interpretation, I bring up the Marian interpretation because this is one that Tolkien himself commented on. And I think his comments, especially in his letters, are the basis of the Marian interpretation. Letter 142 is his earliest comment on the Marian interpretation, and that is him simply agreeing with the reader who said, hey, I noticed these parallels. I noticed this imagery. And Tolkien says, yeah, I could see that. I suppose you're right. But later when we get to letter 320, which is published toward the end of his life, he's actively saying, no, she was a conscious presence in my mind as I was creating the character. So as we go throughout the years, the Marian association grows in his mind. And that may be why he seems to want to lessen her guilt, to absolve her of those sins. Because he seems to have tried to make her more Marian by absolving her of any sin associated with the rebellion and the kinslaying. First, the ban is abandoned. Then her pride is lessened. And then she's fighting against Feanor and his evil deeds. And eventually she's removed from the rebellion altogether. She becomes more and more Marian. She approaches the Immaculate Conception. But if she is the Immaculate Conception, what are the stakes for her temptation by the ring? If she's immune from sin, if she's immune from temptation, if she is this Marian figure, then there's no moral stakes to her temptation. However, if she's subject to sin such as pride, such as ambition, if the ring presents a genuine moral test, Is she as marrying as Tolkien wants to make her out to be? Well, I guess it all depends on which Galadriel you're looking at, which Galadriel you want to construct. And finally, there's the question of derivative interpretations. I think that most of us in this room probably first encountered Galadriel when we read The Fellowship of the Ring. And she probably came across as something like that. Ethereal, mysterious, her robes shimmer. You got that silver light all around her. Even her robes kind of look like the traditional robes that you see Mary in Western art. Almost as if she's ready to open her tilma and the roses fall out just like Our Lady of Guadalupe. That's how I saw Galadriel when I first encountered her. Is that Galadriel? Or is that Galadriel? Jackson seems to have taken the episode with the temptation and the description that Galadriel has of her vision of what she might, and he seems to have run with it as far as he could go. That Galadriel is terrifying. I don't know that if Frodo and Sam encountered that Galadriel, that they would be as comforted as they were, by the Galadriel that we all met in the Fellowship of the Ring. So is that Galadriel, or is this Galadriel? Or is this Galadriel? I don't know about you, but I can't see the Galadriel that I first encountered in Tolkien's novel wearing armor. However, even this Galadriel does have a textual basis. In one of his letters, when Tolkien describes Galadriel as Amazon in disposition, Tolkien studied classics before he switched to English. He knew what he was saying when he said Amazon. But for many audiences, especially young American teenage boy audiences that things like this are marketed to, when they see Amazon, they think of Wonder Woman. Oops. They think of action hero. And then there's also Hollywood gender politics these days that wants the strong female warrior, strong female character. So Galadriel is turned now into a warrior princess. I don't know that Tolkien had this. I can't speak for him, but I don't think Tolkien had this in mind when he created this character. However, many audiences are now coming to Tolkien through these derivative portrayals. And these derivative portrayals, they illustrate the problem of the constructed Galadriel. Whether it's one of the apocryphal Galadriels we saw, or whether it's one of those derivative, they illustrate that problem of a constructed Galadriel. Yes, there is a textual authority, but it's kind of a chicken and egg problem. Was the derivative portrayal decided upon, and then we're going to go seek out textual evidence to support it? Or did they draw the derivative portrayal from the texts? It suits the derivative agenda, resulting in interpretation that reflects the interpreter more than the author. And indeed, the interpreter becomes the author, and everything becomes conflated to where we no longer have a character called Galadriel, we have a descriptor, Galadriel, that we put in what we want into. So I would just close with the question, should I remove the question mark? Is it time to remove the question mark? The apocryphal Galadriel of Tolkien's extra-narrative writings, especially when you view through that death of the author framework, which is kind of the framework that I approached this entire presentation from. It renders Galadriel a descriptor. The character just simply becomes a repository, a vessel that is filled with whatever the reader, the critic, the viewer, the interpreter wants to fulfill it. So we no longer have a Galadriel, we have any number of possible Galadriels. That's the question I'd like to leave you with. Is it time to remove the question mark? And with that, I'd like to extend my thanks to Professor Pizzini for the invitation, to Dr. Fliss at Marquette, who's been valuable in helping me navigate the archive, to my advisor, Dr. Canavan at Marquette, to Dr. Jacob Ryeff, who suggested the title. When he and I first started talking about this, he first suggested the staff at Marquette, the staff at Rayner Library there, and the staff here at the Bodleian, and especially for all of his contributions. You can see how hard at work he is. If there was anything good in this presentation, it was his ideas. And with that, and also, of course, sources consulted. And with that, of course, would like to thank you all for your time, your attention, and for not throwing tomatoes at me.